In the 18th century, Ben Franklin is looking at the Germans and saying, you guys are stupid and you're swarthy and we don't want you here. We want to keep our colonies as white as possible. And you fast forward 150 years and you have Hitler saying, to lots of other ethnic groups in Europe, like, you guys are stupid and you're swarthy and we don't want you here and we want to keep our country as white as possible. And the irony of that is astounding to me. Ben Franklin was looking down on them and saying, you're not good enough to come over here. You're not white enough to come over here. Like, don't come over here and mess up our stuff. But I want to just make the argument here that I don't think white is a thing. White is a color of a crayon. Hi, I'm Danielle Romero, and thanks so much for being with me on my channel, where I have been delving into my family's ancestry and how that connects to the American story and the immigrant story. We're going to dive into the German immigrant experience at the time of Ben Franklin. Even in the early years of the United States, immigration was a point of contention for some of the founding fathers. Benjamin Franklin, a prominent figure in American history, expressed concerns about German immigrants moving into the 13 colonies in the mid-18th century. In his essay titled Observations Concerning the Increasing of Mankind, Peopling of Countries, etc., which was written in 1755, Franklin reacted to the influx of German immigrants and the potential negative impact on the American colonies. And a little bit later on in the video, I want to share some of the pretty shocking things he wrote about the German immigrants coming to the country. Now, growing up, I loved American history. I was a little girl. My dad and I would sit and watch Civil War documentaries on the couch. They were on PBS. And I think that was probably my earliest memory of just wanting to know more about the American story. And as I got older, I started realizing that, like, there are many facets to the American story. And I think sometimes they are willfully revised. And I think other times, there's the sin of omission. And I think sometimes there's so much nuance to the story that it's almost impossible for one person to cover all of it at one time. Franklin had a lot of concerns about immigrants, in particular German immigrants. According to him, they weren't the sharpest tools in the shed, so to speak. He famously wrote this about them, quote, "Those who come hither are generally of the most ignorant, stupid sort of their own nation." Ouch. But he goes on to say that the Germans struggled to adapt to the local way of life here in America. In his eyes, the German immigrants posed a threat to New England's whiteness because of their, quote, "swarthy complexion," unquote. Franklin even worried that Pennsylvania, which was founded by the English, would end up more German instead of the German immigrants embracing English language and custom. He said, "Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will be shortly so numerous as to Germanize us instead of us Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion." And guess what? Benjamin Franklin was actually not the only founding father who had concerns about German immigrants back in the day. Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant mind we all know from the musical, also had his reservations. He actually believed that an influx of foreigners would create a mishmash of cultures and it would corrupt the national spirit and complicate public opinion. Funny enough, to support his view, Alexander Hamilton actually pointed to a precedent in which being open to foreigners was detrimental. And what he pointed to was the extermination of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And he said on that, quote, "Perhaps a lesson is here taught which ought not to be despised." That saying that the Native Americans shouldn't have been as friendly to the settlers as they were. Look what happened to him. And then he's turning that around and saying, look, maybe we should look at what happened to them and not be so welcoming to these immigrants. Now, even Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, felt a bit uneasy about German immigrants forming their own communities and holding on to their language, their habits, and their principles of government. He wrote, As to other foreigners, it is thought better to discourage their settling together in large masses, Jefferson wrote, wherein, as in our German settlements, they preserve for a long time their own languages, habits, and principles of government. Benjamin Franklin also wrote this in a letter. He said, quote, which leads me to add one remark, that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionately very small. All Africa is black or tawny. Asia is chiefly tawny. America, exclusive of the newcomers, wholly so. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, the French, the Russians, and the Swedes are generally of what we call swarthy complexions. The Swedes are swarthy. I don't know. As are the Germans also, the Saxons only excepted, who with the English make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. I wish their numbers were increased. Why should, in the sight of superior beings, darken its people? Why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America, where we have so far an opportunity, by excluding all blacks and tawnies, of increasing the lovely white and red? Now, I did some research to kind of figure out, was he referring to Native Americans when he said red? My reading of this primary source is that he's not referring to Native Americans. I think he's talking kind of about maybe like the redness of cheek you might see on someone with fairer skin, because earlier in the same paragraph, he refers to America as Native Americans as tawny. So I think he's not referring to them by saying red. But perhaps I am partial to the complexion of my country, for such kind of partiality is nature to mankind, unquote. From the Census Bureau records, I saw that Americans who have German ancestry actually comprise about 50 million people. It may actually be more at this point, making them the largest ancestry group ahead of the Irish Americans, the African Americans, and the English Americans at this point. So at this point, Americans with German ancestry are the majority group. I want to read another quote of Benjamin Franklin's from that document. In short, unless the stream of their importation could be turned from this to other colonies, that's to say, if we can't divert the Germans from coming here and sending them there, they will soon outnumber us. And all that the advantages we have will not, in my opinion, be able to preserve our language, and even our government will become precarious. But let's not forget that the Germans, like all these other immigrants, were just pieces of a puzzle. The story of America is one of immigrants. Whether our founding fathers recognized that they were actually immigrants as well, people from different backgrounds were all contributing their unique talents and their cultures to the tapestry of this nation. And yes, the conversation about immigration has persisted throughout our history. This is not something where we can, look back and say, hey, we did a really good job back in this decade. Like, this is something that we've been working through for a long time. In the 18th century, Ben Franklin is looking at the Germans and saying, you guys are stupid and you're swarthy and we don't want you here. We want to keep our colonies as white as possible. And you fast forward 150 years and you have Hitler saying, to lots of other ethnic groups in Europe, like, you guys are stupid and you're swarthy and we don't want you here and we want to keep our country as white as possible. And the irony of that is astounding to me. And I think it again is this same theme that we've seen happening over and over again throughout this series of becoming American. This idea of whiteness, I don't think it's not a reality. And this is not revisionist history. I know I get like a lot of comments accusing me of like doing CRT or revisionist history. This is not revisionist history. I think this is stopping and looking and saying there's a dissonance here with the terminology, and it's getting applied in different ways over and over again. And groups are being given this, being said they're not white enough. And then a little bit later, now they're white and other groups aren't white enough. And it makes me want to step back and say, well, what is white? And this is a video that I am working on right now. I want to just make the argument here that I don't think white is a thing. Like, white is a color of a crayon. For a while, the Germans were seeing, some of the Germans were seeing themselves at the pinnacle of race, right? They were the best, they were the Aryans, and they were going to get rid of everyone who was not as good as them. Ben Franklin was looking down on them and saying, "You're not good enough to come over here. You're not white enough to come over here. Like, don't come over here and mess up our stuff." And I think when we start poking holes in this idea that you have to fit into these categories, it makes it really hard to make people the other. You know, Ben Franklin's looking at the Germans and saying, like, they're not white enough to come over. We don't want them over here. And then 150 years later, you have Hitler saying, we're the pinnacle of the Aryan race, and we're going to get rid of everybody who's not white enough. It's just a cycle. So, you know, we're kind of like the family that has all the stepkids, and we're trying to find our place in our house, and we all belong here, but we're all bringing in different experiences and different histories. And if we could just start seeing ourselves as a family instead of putting each other into these tiny little boxes, I think things could change drastically for the better. And so I thank you so much for being here for this conversation. And let me know in the comments if you knew about Ben Franklin's animosity towards the Germans. If you'd like to see any more videos that have to do with becoming American and kind of researching, following me along this journey of researching the immigrant experience, I'll link to them right here and you can check them out. Otherwise, I will see you next time.